Attention! Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in Shreveport history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1848, the plantation records of DeSoto Parish contained an entry that would later confound historians and investigators for more than a century. The notation, written in careful script by Overseer William Hayes, simply read, "Martha, whereabouts unknown. Personal effects remain untouched." What made this particular disappearance so troubling was not merely the fact that an enslaved woman had vanished without explanation, but rather the circumstances surrounding her absence and the strange behavior exhibited by those who had known her. Martha Boone, a woman of approximately 25 years, according to surviving documentation, had worked the Whitmore plantation along the Red River for nearly a decade before her disappearance. The plantation itself, owned by Colonel James Whitmore, encompassed nearly 3,000 acres of cotton fields and timber, stretching from the river's edge to the pine forests that marked the boundary with neighboring properties. The main house, a two-story structure built of cypress wood and brick, sat elevated on a slight rise overlooking the quarters where the enslaved population lived. Contemporary accounts describe Martha as possessing an unusual ability to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. Fellow workers often sought her counsel regarding planting times and harvest preparations. This reputation for foresight, while valued by some, had also drawn unwanted attention from those who viewed such knowledge with suspicion and fear. The Whitmore plantation operated much like others throughout the region during this period. Dawn brought the sound of the plantation bell, calling workers to the fields where they would labor until sunset under the supervision of Hayes and 2 assistant overseers. The quarters consisted of 12 wooden structures, each housing multiple families in cramped conditions. A small chapel, built by the enslaved community themselves, served as the center of spiritual life on the property. Martha's daily routine had remained consistent for years. She rose before dawn to tend the vegetable garden behind her quarters, a plot of land she had cultivated with exceptional skill. Neighbors later recalled that her garden produced vegetables of unusual size and quality, even during seasons when other gardens failed. After morning prayers at the chapel, she would join the field hands for the day's work, returning each evening to her quarters where she lived alone. The first signs that something was amiss came during the 3rd week of October 1848. Several workers reported that Martha had begun speaking in whispers to herself while working, often pausing in her tasks to listen to sounds that others could not hear. When questioned about this behavior, she would only say that the ground was speaking and that old promises were being remembered. On the morning of October 29th, Martha failed to appear for morning prayers. This absence was highly unusual, as she had been known for her punctual attendance at all chapel services. Hayes discovered her quarters empty. With her few possessions, a worn Bible, 2 cotton dresses, and a small wooden box containing seeds, arranged neatly on her cot, as if she had prepared for a journey. What troubled investigators most was the condition of Martha's garden. The vegetable plants appeared to have been carefully harvested and the soil turned over with meticulous precision. Stakes that had supported climbing plants were arranged in a perfect circle around a patch of disturbed earth at the garden's center. No footprints led away from the area, and no one could recall seeing Martha working in the garden during the days preceding her disappearance. The plantation's other residents offered conflicting accounts of Martha's final days. Some claimed she had spoken of visions involving her grandmother. a woman who had died years earlier. Others insisted they had heard her singing unfamiliar songs late at night, melodies that seemed to drift from the direction of the chapel, despite the building being locked after evening prayers. Hayes conducted a thorough search of the plantation grounds, examining the quarters, outbuildings, and fields for any sign of Martha or clues to her fate. The search expanded to include the wooded areas beyond the cultivated land, where old hunting trails wound through dense stands of pine and oak. Local authorities were notified, and notices were posted in Shreveport describing Martha's appearance, though such efforts rarely yielded results in cases involving enslaved persons. During the search, workers discovered something that would add another layer of mystery to Martha's disappearance. In the chapel, hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the altar, they found a collection of small fabric bundles. Each bundle contained herbs, dried flowers, and what appeared to be personal items, locks of hair, buttons, and scraps of cloth. The items seemed to have been placed there recently, though no one admitted to knowledge of their origin or purpose. The discovery of these bundles prompted Colonel Whitmore to question his enslaved population more intensively. Under pressure, several individuals admitted that Martha had been collecting these items for weeks, claiming she was preparing protection for the community. The exact nature of this protection remained unclear, as did the reason Martha felt such measures were necessary. As winter approached, the search for Martha gradually diminished in intensity. Hayes continued to file reports with local authorities, but the investigation essentially stalled due to lack of evidence and, some suspected, lack of genuine interest in pursuing the matter further. The official position became that Martha had likely fled north, joining the growing number of enslaved persons seeking freedom through underground networks. However, those who had known Martha best found this explanation unconvincing. She had never expressed interest in escape and had formed strong bonds with the plantation's religious community. Her deep attachment to the land itself, evidenced by her exceptional gardening skills, made it unlikely she would abandon everything familiar for the uncertainties of flight. The winter months brought an unusual series of problems to the Whitmore plantation. Crops stored in the main barn began rotting at an accelerated rate despite proper preservation methods. Livestock exhibited nervous behavior, often refusing to enter certain areas of the property. Several workers reported illness characterized by persistent coughs and unexplained fatigue, symptoms that local medical practitioners could not adequately explain or treat. These difficulties prompted Colonel Whitmore to bring in a new overseer in early 1849. Thomas Mitchell, a man with extensive experience managing plantation operations, arrived from Louisiana with a reputation for efficiency and strict discipline. His first act was to thoroughly examine all aspects of the plantation's operation, including a detailed review of the circumstances surrounding Martha's disappearance. Mitchell's investigation took a different approach from Hayes's earlier efforts. Rather than focusing on where Martha might have gone, he concentrated on understanding her daily activities and relationships during the weeks preceding her disappearance. This approach revealed patterns of behavior that previous investigators had overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. Interviews with Martha's closest associates revealed that she had been receiving visitors during the nights leading up to her disappearance. These visitors came from other plantations in the area, traveling considerable distances under cover of darkness to meet with her in the chapel. The purpose of these meetings remained unclear, but participants described them as involving prayer, singing, and discussions of old knowledge passed down through generations. Further investigation uncovered evidence that Martha had been in contact with free persons of color living in Shreveport, individuals who maintained connections with enslaved communities throughout the region. These connections suggested a network of communication and mutual assistance that operated largely outside the awareness of white authorities. The more Mitchell learned about Martha's activities, the more convinced he became that her disappearance was not a simple case of flight, but rather part of something more complex and organized. His reports to Colonel Whitmore expressed concern that Martha's influence had extended beyond spiritual matters into areas that could potentially threaten plantation stability and security. In spring 1849, Mitchell made a discovery that would fundamentally change the investigation's direction. While examining storage areas beneath the main house, he found evidence of recent excavation. Soil had been disturbed and carefully replaced, creating a hidden chamber approximately 6 feet square and 4 feet deep. The chamber was empty when discovered, but the precision of its construction suggested considerable planning and effort. The hidden chamber's location, directly beneath the colonel's study, raised immediate security concerns. Mitchell theorized that the chamber had been used for meetings or storage of materials related to organized resistance activities. The timing of the excavation, based on soil analysis and weather patterns, appeared to coincide with the period of Martha's mysterious nighttime meetings. Colonel Whitmore ordered a comprehensive security review of the entire plantation. Guards were posted at strategic locations, and movement restrictions were implemented for all residents. These measures, while increasing security, also created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affected daily operations and community relationships. Despite intensive efforts, no direct connection between Martha and the hidden chamber could be established. However, the discovery prompted authorities to examine other plantations in the area for similar security vulnerabilities. These investigations revealed that the Whitmore plantation was not unique in experiencing mysterious disappearances and unexplained incidents during this period. Regional law enforcement began coordinating their efforts to address what they perceived as a growing threat to plantation security. Communication networks between properties were strengthened, and procedures for reporting suspicious activities were standardized. These measures reflected growing concern among plantation owners about organized resistance movements and their potential impact on the institution of slavery. The summer of 1849 brought new developments that seemed to confirm these concerns. Several other plantations reported similar disappearances, always involving individuals known for their leadership within enslaved communities. In each case, the missing persons had been involved in religious activities and had maintained extensive networks of relationships across multiple properties. Investigators began to suspect that these disappearances were connected and represented elements of a coordinated plan rather than individual acts of flight. This theory gained credibility when authorities discovered evidence of communication between missing persons prior to their disappearances. Letters and messages, written in coded language, suggested planning and coordination that extended across parish boundaries. The investigation into Martha's disappearance became part of a larger effort to identify and disrupt what authorities believed to be an organized resistance network. Resources were allocated for surveillance operations, and informants were recruited from within enslaved communities to provide information about suspicious activities and communications. These investigative efforts yielded mixed results. While several individuals were arrested and charged with various offenses related to suspected resistance activities, the core leadership of any organized movement remained elusive. The disappeared persons, including Martha, were never located despite extensive searches and investigations. As 1849 drew to a close, Colonel Whitmore faced a difficult decision regarding the future of his plantation operations. The security concerns and investigative activities had disrupted normal routines and created an atmosphere of tension that affected productivity and community stability. Some neighboring plantation owners had begun selling their properties and relocating to areas perceived as more secure. Mitchell's reports during this period painted a picture of a community under siege, though the exact nature of the threat remained unclear. His correspondence with authorities in Shreveport expressed frustration with the lack of concrete evidence despite months of intensive investigation. The missing persons had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions and suspicions. Winter brought a temporary lull in investigative activities, but spring 1850 would see renewed efforts to solve the mysteries surrounding Martha's disappearance and related incidents. Federal authorities had begun taking interest in the situation, viewing it as potentially significant to broader questions of national security and the stability of the slavery system in contested territories. The arrival of federal investigators marked a new phase in the search for answers about Martha and the other disappeared persons. These investigators brought resources and expertise that local authorities lacked, including the ability to coordinate searches across state boundaries and access to information networks maintained by various government agencies. Initial federal investigations focused on identifying patterns and connections that might have been overlooked by local authorities. This approach revealed that similar disappearances had occurred in other states, often following patterns remarkably similar to those observed in Louisiana. The scope of potential coordination suggested organization and planning that exceeded anything previously imagined by local investigators. Federal investigators also brought different perspectives on the significance of evidence that local authorities had dismissed or overlooked. The hidden chamber beneath Colonel Whitmore's study, for example, was recognized as consistent with storage facilities used by organized resistance movements in other regions. The precision of its construction suggested knowledge and skills that implied training and coordination. The religious activities that had been central to Martha's life and the lives of other disappeared persons also received renewed attention. Federal investigators recognized that religious gatherings could serve multiple purposes, providing cover for planning activities while building the trust and loyalty necessary for coordinated resistance efforts. These insights led to a fundamental re-evaluation of the evidence surrounding Martha's disappearance. Rather than viewing her as an individual who had fled or been harmed, investigators began to consider the possibility that her disappearance had been planned and coordinated as part of a larger strategy. This perspective suggested that Martha might still be alive and active in resistance activities elsewhere. The implications of this theory extended far beyond the boundaries of DeSoto Parish. If Martha and other disappeared persons were indeed part of an organized movement, their knowledge of plantation operations, security measures, and community networks could pose significant threats to the stability of slavery throughout the region. This realization prompted expanded security measures and investigative efforts across multiple states. However, despite the resources and expertise brought to bear on the investigation, concrete evidence of Martha's fate remained elusive. The federal investigators, like their local predecessors, found themselves confronting a mystery that seemed to resist solution despite intensive efforts and advanced investigative techniques. By 1851, the investigation had reached what appeared to be an impasse. While investigators had developed theories about Martha's disappearance and its potential connections to organized resistance activities, they had been unable to locate her or any of the other missing persons. The lack of concrete evidence frustrated both federal and local authorities, who had invested considerable resources in the investigation. The impact of the investigation extended beyond law enforcement agencies to affect the communities where the disappearances had occurred. The atmosphere of suspicion and security measures had fundamentally altered daily life on plantations throughout the region. Relationships between enslaved persons and their owners had become more strained, while communication and movement restrictions had disrupted traditional community patterns. For Colonel Whitmore, the investigation's failure to resolve the mystery of Martha's disappearance represented both a security concern and a financial burden. The disruptions to plantation operations had reduced productivity and profitability, while the ongoing security measures required resources that could have been invested in agricultural improvements or expansion. Despite these pressures, Whitmore continued to cooperate with investigative efforts, hoping that resolution of the mystery would allow him to restore normal operations and rebuild community relationships. His correspondence during this period reflects a man caught between competing demands and uncertain about the best path forward. The investigation's lack of progress also affected the broader political context surrounding questions of slavery and resistance. Politicians and policymakers who had hoped that successful resolution of the investigation would demonstrate the government's ability to maintain order found themselves confronting evidence that organized resistance might be more sophisticated and extensive than previously believed. These political implications contributed to growing tensions between different factions within government and society regarding how to address the challenges posed by slavery and resistance. The failure to solve the Martha Boone case became symbolic of broader difficulties in maintaining the stability of an institution that was increasingly under pressure from both internal and external forces. As the investigation gradually wound down in 1852, authorities faced the uncomfortable reality that Martha's disappearance would likely remain unsolved. The resources that had been dedicated to the case were redirected to other priorities, though surveillance and security measures on plantations throughout the region remained elevated as a precautionary measure. The official conclusion was that Martha had likely fled north and successfully escaped to freedom, possibly with assistance from organized networks that helped enslaved persons reach free territories. This explanation, while plausible, failed to account for many of the mysterious circumstances surrounding her disappearance and the evidence of planning and coordination that investigators had uncovered. For those who had known Martha personally, the official explanation remained unsatisfactory. They continued to believe that her deep connections to the land and community made voluntary departure unlikely, regardless of the assistance that might have been available to her. These doubts persisted long after the official investigation had ended, contributing to local folklore and oral traditions that would preserve alternative theories about her fate. The legacy of Martha's disappearance extended beyond the immediate investigation to influence how authorities approached similar cases in subsequent years. The techniques and procedures developed during the investigation became standard practice for addressing suspected resistance activities, while the challenges encountered highlighted the limitations of traditional investigative approaches when confronting organized opposition. The case also contributed to growing awareness among plantation owners and authorities that the enslaved population possessed capabilities and resources that had been systematically underestimated. The evidence of communication networks, planning abilities, and coordinated action revealed during the investigation challenged assumptions about the nature of slavery and the potential for organized resistance. In 1853, nearly 5 years after Martha's disappearance, a development occurred that briefly renewed interest in the case. Workers renovating the chapel on the Whitmore plantation discovered additional hidden spaces that had not been found during earlier searches. These spaces contained documents and materials that appeared to date from the period immediately preceding Martha's disappearance. The documents included what appeared to be maps of the local area, with markings indicating routes and locations that could not be immediately identified. There were also lists of names and dates that seemed to correspond to individuals and events related to the resistance networks that investigators had suspected but never been able to fully document. Most significantly, the hidden materials included a journal written in Martha's hand. The journal entries covered a period of several months leading up to her disappearance and provided the first direct evidence of her thoughts and activities during this crucial time. The entries revealed a woman grappling with difficult decisions and aware that her actions carried significant risks for herself and others. The journal entries described meetings with individuals from other plantations and discussions of plans that were never explicitly detailed but clearly involved coordinated action of some kind. Martha wrote about her sense of responsibility to her community and her belief that the time for action was approaching, though she seemed to struggle with uncertainty about the wisdom of the course being pursued. The discovery of the journal prompted a brief resurgence of investigative activity, as authorities hoped that the new evidence might finally provide answers to the questions that had persisted for years. However, analysis of the journal's contents raised as many new questions as it answered, particularly regarding the identity of Martha's contacts and the specific nature of the plans being discussed. Federal investigators returned to DeSoto Parish to examine the new evidence and determine whether it warranted reopening the case. Their analysis confirmed the journal's authenticity and provided insights into Martha's state of mind during the weeks preceding her disappearance. But it did not resolve the fundamental mystery of what had actually happened to her. The journal's final entry, dated 3 days before Martha's disappearance, was particularly haunting in its ambiguity. She wrote about crossing over to the other side and leaving this place of sorrow behind, language that could be interpreted as referring to escape, death, or some form of spiritual transformation. The entry concluded with the words, "May those who come after understand what we could not say," suggesting awareness that her words might be discovered and read by others. Analysis of the other materials found with the journal provided additional context but no definitive answers. The maps appeared to show routes through the pine forests and swamplands surrounding the plantation, areas that would have provided concealment for movement but would also have been extremely dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with their hazards. The lists of names and dates included some individuals who were known to have disappeared from other plantations during the same general period, supporting theories about coordinated resistance activities. However, many of the names could not be identified, and the significance of the dates remained unclear despite extensive research. By 1854, even this renewed investigative effort had reached its limits. The new evidence, while fascinating, had not provided the breakthrough that authorities had hoped for. The case of Martha Boone's disappearance was officially closed, though it remained a subject of speculation and discussion among those familiar with its details. The impact of the case on local communities persisted long after the official investigation ended. Security measures that had been implemented during the search for Martha remained in place on many plantations, fundamentally altering the relationship between enslaved persons and their owners. Trust, already limited by the nature of the slavery system, had been further eroded by years of suspicion and surveillance. For Colonel Whitmore, the resolution of the investigation marked the end of a difficult chapter in his plantation's history. However, the changes that had occurred during the investigation's course could not be easily reversed. The community that had existed before Martha's disappearance had been permanently altered by the events that followed her vanishing. The plantation itself continued to operate, but never again achieved the level of productivity and stability that had characterized its earlier years. Workers remained wary and distant, while management struggled to rebuild the relationships and trust necessary for efficient agricultural operations. These challenges reflected broader changes occurring throughout the region as the institution of slavery faced increasing pressures from multiple directions. In the years following the case's official closure, Martha's disappearance became part of local folklore and oral tradition. Stories about her fate varied widely, with some maintaining that she had successfully escaped to freedom, while others suggested darker possibilities. These stories reflected the continued impact of her disappearance on those who had known her and the community she had left behind. The documentation of Martha's case, including the official investigation reports and the journal discovered years later, was eventually transferred to archives in Shreveport and later to state facilities in Baton Rouge. However, access to these materials remained restricted for many decades, limiting scholarly research and public knowledge about the case and its broader implications. It was not until 1962, more than a century after Martha's disappearance, that researchers gained access to the complete case files. Dr. Robert Patterson, a historian at Louisiana State University, was conducting research on antebellum resistance movements when he discovered the Martha Boone materials in the state archives. His analysis revealed the case's significance as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of suspected organized resistance activity from the pre-Civil War period. Patterson's research brought the case to the attention of other scholars, who recognized its value for understanding the complexity and sophistication of resistance networks during the slavery era. The evidence of planning, coordination and communication revealed in the investigation challenged prevailing assumptions about the capabilities and organization of enslaved communities. However, even with access to the complete documentation, researchers were unable to definitively resolve the mystery of what had actually happened to Martha. The evidence supported multiple theories but proved none conclusively. She might have successfully escaped to freedom. She might have been killed in an attempt to prevent her activities, or she might have died from natural causes in a location where her body was never discovered. The ambiguity surrounding Martha's fate became a metaphor for the broader challenges facing historians studying resistance during the slavery period. The deliberate secrecy necessary for such activities meant that many important events and individuals left little or no documentation, creating gaps in the historical record that could never be completely filled. Dr. Patterson's research was published in 1965 as part of a broader study of resistance movements in Louisiana. His work brought Martha's story to public attention for the first time and sparked renewed interest in the case among both scholars and the general public. However, it also highlighted the limitations of historical research when confronting events that participants had deliberately obscured or concealed. The publication of Patterson's research coincided with growing interest in African American history and the experiences of enslaved persons. Civil rights activists and scholars saw in Martha's story an example of the courage and determination that had characterized resistance to slavery throughout the American South. Her disappearance became symbolic of the countless individuals who had risked everything in pursuit of freedom. However, the ambiguous nature of the evidence meant that Martha's story could be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the perspective and assumptions of those examining it. Some saw her as a successful escapee who had outwitted a system designed to prevent such escapes. Others viewed her as a victim of that same system, whose fate illustrated the terrible risks faced by those who challenged slavery's authority. The renewed attention to Martha's case also prompted efforts to locate additional documentation that might shed light on her fate. Researchers examined records from free black communities in northern states, looking for any evidence that Martha or other disappeared persons from Louisiana had successfully reached safety. These efforts yielded some intriguing possibilities, but no definitive proof. Similarly, Archaeological investigations were conducted at locations identified in Martha's journal and the materials found with it. These excavations revealed evidence of human activity in remote areas of the pine forests, but the remains and artifacts discovered could not be definitively linked to Martha or her contemporaries. The passage of time and the natural processes of decay had obscured whatever evidence might once have existed. By 1968, the renewed investigation had reached its own limits. Despite the application of modern research techniques and resources, the fundamental mystery of Martha's disappearance remained unsolved. The case had become a symbol of the broader challenges facing historians and archaeologists studying the experiences of enslaved persons and the resistance movements they created. The legacy of Martha Boone's disappearance continues to influence research and public understanding of slavery and resistance in the American South. Her story serves as a reminder of the courage and determination of individuals who risked everything to challenge an unjust system, while also illustrating the tremendous obstacles they faced and the prices they often paid for their actions. The documentation of her case provides unique insights into the sophistication and organization of resistance networks during the antebellum period. The evidence of communication, planning, and coordination revealed in the investigation demonstrates that enslaved communities possessed capabilities and resources that were systematically underestimated by their contemporaries and continue to be underappreciated by many historians today. Yet the ultimate ambiguity surrounding Martha's fate also reflects the broader challenges facing anyone attempting to understand the full scope and impact of resistance to slavery. The deliberate secrecy necessary for such activities means that much of this history remains hidden or lost, known only to those who participated and carried their knowledge with them to their graves. The pine forests and swamplands around Shreveport keep their secrets still. Somewhere in those tangled woodlands, beneath decades of fallen leaves and the steady progression of seasonal growth, may lie the answers to questions that have persisted for more than a century. Or perhaps Martha Boone did indeed escape, living out her days in freedom under a new name in a distant place. Her true story known only to herself and those who helped her along the way. What remains certain is that her disappearance marked a turning point in the history of DeSoto Parish and the broader struggle between slavery and freedom in the American South. The investigation that followed revealed the existence of networks and capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of slavery and the potential for organized resistance. These revelations contributed to growing tensions that would eventually explode into civil war and the ultimate destruction of the institution that had shaped Martha's world. The questions raised by her case continue to resonate today, reminding us that history often conceals as much as it reveals, and that the experiences of those who challenged injustice are not always preserved in the official records. Martha Boone's legacy lies not in the certainty of her fate, but in the courage of her actions, and the enduring mystery of what became of a woman who dared to seek something better than the life into which she had been born. In the end, perhaps the most important truth about Martha's disappearance is not where she went or what happened to her, but what her story tells us about the human spirit's refusal to accept injustice and the lengths to which people will go in pursuit of freedom and dignity. Whether she died in those Louisiana pine forests or lived to see emancipation in some distant place, her courage and determination continue to inspire those who study her story and seek to understand the complex history of resistance to slavery in America. The records of her case, now preserved in climate-controlled archives, stand as testimony to one woman's refusal to accept the circumstances of her birth as the limits of her destiny. They remind us that behind every statistic and every historical generalization stood individual human beings who made choices, took risks, and paid prices that we can barely imagine from the safety of our contemporary perspective. Martha Boone vanished into the Louisiana darkness more than a century and a half ago, but her story continues to shed light on one of the darkest chapters in American history. In seeking to understand what happened to her, we gain insight not only into the past, but into the ongoing struggle for justice and human dignity that connects her time to our own.